Welcome to the second part of my series on Fortnite zones. If you haven't already, I would highly suggest that you go back to watch the first part right now so that you can start from the beginning and don't miss any of the crazy things that I found out about first and second zones. In this part we will cover the third and fourth zones. We'll talk about whether you can predict where they will go, how to maximise your chances of getting zones, and of course we'll talk more about what on earth is happening in the southeast area of the map. Let's get into it with the third zone. First of all, hopefully you remember from the previous video that Zone 1 has a limit to how far out it can go, as does Zone 2. But in Zone 3 that limit is gone, and here are the centres of the third zones for 60,000 games. Centres of zones can go all the way to the far coastlines, and there was a third zone that actually looked like this. The centre cannot be outside the main coastline, such as this location, but some water areas can have zone centres. They are defined as being inside the island's area. As with the zones in the last video, I will show you the chances of each POI being in the third zone. Pony now overtakes Tilted at the top, but it's close and they're still the top two by far with over 5% chance. Languishing down the bottom is a whole load of southeast areas mostly, with poor Condo resigned to one third zone in every 300 games. How about predicting third zones? In the previous video we saw that when first zone pulls far, second zone often does too. And I looked to see whether third zones pulled far when first or second zone pulled far or pulled back. There was no significant correlation. I also looked at the direction in which zones pulled with regards to the absolute position of the second zone, and it was random as well. In fact, I looked at everything I could think of and found that in general, the third zone is effectively a totally random circle within the second zone, which I verified by simulating a million third zone choices and comparing it to the actual distribution, and all the probabilities matched up. There are a few exceptions to this that we'll get to in a bit. For now, let's zoom in on the map and look at the random second zones so that we can see it better. The randomness of third zones within second zones does mean that the central areas of the second zone are more likely to be in the third zone. As I explained in the previous video about getting second zones, if you're in the very centre of this zone you will always be at least on the edge of the next zone. There is a pixel in the middle that gives you a 100% chance. Notice that this chance drops off very quickly as you move outwards though. If you want that big chance, you do need to be extremely near the centre. Right on the edge you pretty much have a 0% chance as you're hoping that the edge of third zone is the same pixel that you are on. But more realistically, you're going to be a tiny bit in from the edge where it's more like 5 to 10%. In a stacked game it can become difficult to get further in than the edge, but now you see the value of rotating early and towards the centre of zone, and the effect snowballs through the game. Because if you're early for first zone and get away from the edge like this green star here compared to all the red positions, then not only do you have a greater chance of getting the next zone, you'll almost always have the freedom to rotate immediately towards the centre of second zone before everyone else, and likewise into third and fourth zones. Even if zone pulls back towards the congested edge, you'll either be in zone or won't have too many people around you blocking your way. Going back to this probability diagram I showed you, I mentioned that there were some exceptions to it, and the first exception is when the boundary of the map comes into play. So if the second zone is really far on edge map, then the possibilities for third zone are a bit limited, as it cannot pull over the ocean. In this situation, you can predict that it will be a near zone, so bear that in mind when zones are like this. The other exception to the probabilities is the dead southeast area, which we will continue to revisit as it is the weirdest feature I've ever found. It is a little extended from what we saw in the second zone, with this triangular area also missing any zone centres. As before, everything here can still be in zone, as we only have the zone centres plotted in pink, but the chance of being in zone there is getting very small. But can we use this dead area to our advantage by predicting some of the zones? Well, if you saw the first video, there were these southeast first zones that could be predicted to have a far second zone with 100% certainty. Let's look for some similar things here for second to third zone. Firstly, let's zoom in on these very same second zones and see their third zones. Well, the third zone cannot pull back towards the centre map due to the dead area. They will all hang around the same area or pull a little bit further out. And this same logic can be applied to any second zone around the edge of the dead area. On the east side, the third zones cannot go back west, they can only go east. And on the west side, they cannot go east, they can only go back towards the west. There is one more interesting case here, which is these second zones that centre over Condo. If we zoom in and look at their third zones, you'll see that they all pull further south. Also, they don't just pull to the same area, they actually move identically with a full max pull, which you can kind of see in the fact that the dot pattern is near identical in both colours here. Unfortunately, this is only one in every 500 games, but at least it's quite an easy one to remember, with the second zone centered over West Condo. Let's move on to fourth zones, and they are a similar story to third zone generally, with zones well spread out other than the restricted empty areas. Here is a heat map to demonstrate the distribution better. The Eastern Islands don't get much love at this point generally, and that's probably because there's not a lot of land there. Some people feel like zones always go over water when it can, but I found that considering how large that area is, it doesn't actually get many zones. It's probably a subconscious bias due to these zones being more memorable than others, and that makes you think they happen more often than they actually do. I'm not going to show you the chances of POIs being in zone or the contour map, because quite frankly the chances of any particular point being in the fourth zone is very small. As for whether the zone will be to the west, east, north or south of third zone, or whether it will go in the same direction as previous zones, I found that it's the same story as the third zone. In general, the fourth zone is a random one within the third zone. Again, you have exceptions at the edge of the map where the centre of the zone can't be out over the ocean, and also the strange case of the southeast. But apart from that, you want to be very near the centre of third zone to have a good chance of getting fourth. It's also potentially the most valuable zone to pull, as it is much more crowded in a stacked game than the previous zones, especially around the edge. So think carefully about whether you can get near centre of third zone to get a free fourth zone. Now fourth zone is where the empty southeastern area gets even more interesting, because if I show you all the fourth zones surrounding that area, you'll see that for the first time there is this large red area that literally cannot be in fourth zone. What does this mean for you? Well, obviously you must try not to position yourself in it during the second or third zone, because you have zero chance of pulling fourth. And if the third zone overlaps some of that area, you know that fourth zone can't go that way. I had people saying that they would need to leave these maps up to refer to while they play, but I think it's not so hard to remember this area. You can just think of it being as everything from Condo Canyon to Sanctuary, with the big temple ruins on the west side and a small lake bounding it on the east. Well, that's it for this part of the Fortnite Zone series. I'm now working on the final installment where I'll be explaining a whole load about how fifth zone and moving zones work, so you can look forward to that one being released next week. Thanks a lot for all the support on these videos, really appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.